After the #1 ranked Japanese bantamweight boxer, Harajima, had been knocked out unconscious by Carlos Rivera, the uncrowned king, Carlos was heading back to the Shiraki Boxing Club with Yoko Shiraki. She told him that his next fight had been scheduled with the Japanese bantamweight champion, Tiger Ozaki, the man who forced the old man to throw in the towel against Joe Yabuki. As they got to the club's office, Robert, who was Carlos Rivera's manager, said, "Miss Yoko, remember our contract specifies just 3 fights. After that, we will leave Japan for now. Our last fight will be with Tiger Ozaki." Robert later revealed that the manager of the world champion, Jose Mendoza, had contacted them, and they would be expecting a title fight very soon. Once they were done talking, Robert told Carlos to go into the gym and continue his regular training and sparring sessions. As they were sparring, Joe Yabuki walked in and began to watch. Even the press were shocked. They murmured, "Wow, Carlos Rivera really fooled us. He is really strong and acts soft in his matches, even against Nango and Harajima, until he knocked them out with a single punch." Joe Yabuki climbed and leaned on the ropes, saying, "Robert, can you tell Carlos to show us his illegal elbow strikes?" Robert was completely speechless and shocked, thinking nobody could ever discover this. The press and journalists exclaimed, "What? What elbow?" Immediately, Yoko Shiraki walked in to observe the training session in her gym. Robert told her to kick the intruder, referring to Joe Yabuki, out of the room. Robert didn't want the situation to escalate, or anyone to know more about the illegal strikes. Joe Yabuki replied calmly, "You're treating me like an intruder. I'm a pro boxer. This is not nice. I just want to watch the training sessions. At least be welcoming." Joe then repeated the same accusation while throwing some popcorn at Carlos's face. "Carlos, please show me your illegal elbow." Not wanting the press to catch wind of this, Miss Yoko immediately told them to leave. Joe Yabuki then said he was broke and wanted to spar with Carlos Rivera for a little cash in return. Initially, Robert declined the idea, but Yoko agreed and said she would pay him. Joe Yabuki changed into his gear and wore his gloves, which were 450-gram gloves to reduce the concentrated impact. The sparring session with Carlos Rivera began. Punches flew everywhere. Carlos said, "Play the music, Robert, play the music," and Robert complied. Joe Yabuki started hitting and taking hits. The sparring grew intense. Carlos Rivera prepared to deliver a punch, but Joe Yabuki landed a cross counter. Carlos fell on his head, collapsing to the floor as he shook uncontrollably. Carlos said, "Okay, Robert, turn off this music. Let's be serious." Seconds after landing the cross counter, Joe Yabuki begins to vomit in the ring. The old man, having heard Joe was sparring at the Shiraki boxing gym, arrived just in time to see him. He said, "Wow, this is what I feared. Joe, what is happening?" Joe vomited in the corner of the ring. Shiraki couldn't look and turned her face away, as did everyone else. Immediately, Joe Yabuki was told to stop fighting. Robert said, "Carlos, that's enough. Let's stop sparring for today." But Carlos Rivera pointed at Joe Yabuki and said, "Look at him. He's still in a fighting pose. He still wants to fight, even after vomiting." The old man tried to intervene, saying, "Let's ring the bell and stop the sparring." But as he approached the bell, Joe Yabuki and Carlos Rivera resumed their brawl, exchanging blow after blow. Joe hit Carlos in the head, and though he wanted to vomit, Carlos knocked the vomit back into his body. Every time Joe attempted to throw up, Carlos wouldn't let him, countering each time. Blood started dripping from Joe's nose. It was a brutal sparring session, the hardest anyone had seen in Ashita no Joe. Despite the tension, Carlos eventually hit Joe with his elbow. Joe exclaimed, As the sparring continued, Robert and the old man struggled to separate them. "Hey, stop! Stop! That's enough, Joe Yabuki and Carlos! That's enough!" Finally, they were pulled apart. Shiraki left the gym, unwilling to witness more chaos. The sparring session ended, but both Joe and Carlos felt unfulfilled and eager to continue. Later that night, Joe Yabuki and Danpei sat watching the sunset. The old man said, "Joe, did you notice that during your fight with Carlos Rivera, you weren't vomiting in the ring later on?" Joe replied, "Very true, old man. I think I've finally overcome the ghosts of Rikishi." Danpei nodded. "Yes, I think you're finally back." The next day, Joe Yabuki, the old man, and the kids began rebuilding the gym to reopen it. As the old man fixed the signboard, the kids joked and teased him, eventually making him fall. He chased them around as they all laughed. Joe smiled and said, "Everything is good. I'm just going to train and do some light jogging." Meanwhile, at the Shiraki Boxing Club, Carlos Rivera, Robert, and Shiraki discussed their last fight in Japan. Robert said, "I've got good news. The Bantamweight world champion, Jose Mendoza, and his team have agreed to terms. The fight is coming up on January 30th in Mexico. You're no longer going to be called the uncrowned king. Congrats, Carlos." Carlos was shocked. Perhaps the fight felt too sudden, or he had other plans. Robert asked, "What's wrong, Carlos? Aren't you going to accept my handshake?" Carlos reluctantly shook his hand. That night, Joe Yabuki attended Carlos Rivera's fight against Tiger Ozaki. During his entrance, Carlos told Robert that since it was his last fight in Japan, he wanted to stop holding back and show his true strength. Robert agreed. As Carlos spotted Joe in the audience, he took the microphone from the announcer and declared, one round," referring to how long the fight would last. This shocked Joe, reminding him of what Rikishi had done to him in juvenile prison. When the bell rang, it took only seconds for Carlos Rivera to annihilate Tiger Ozaki. Ozaki lay bleeding on the floor as Carlos won the belt with a knockout in the first round, just as he had predicted. Joe Yabuki and Carlos Rivera exchanged stares. Joe's eyes began to sparkle, and his fire reignited. It became clear that the two were destined to meet in the ring,